Today's video is on the topic of Quebec independence from Canada. Now, because this is a very controversial topic with a lot of, somewhat messy history in Canadian politics, I thought I'd share a few words on why I'm making this video to begin with and what my intention is here. For context, the person I'm speaking to in this conversation is a guy named Jérémy Côté, who reached out to me. He's a viewer of this channel, and he asked if I wanted to do something on the topic of Quebec independence. And the answer is yes. I've actually been wanting to touch on this topic for quite a while, because I'm not sure if people are aware of this, but support for Quebec independence is rising quite quickly, especially among younger people in Quebec. Some recent polling data showed that it's over 50% of people under, I believe, age 34 who support Quebec independence. The other reason I want to make this video is I haven't seen anything like this on YouTube. I think a lot of the debate and talk around Quebec independence happens in the French language. I think, or maybe English commentators speaking to each other about, why does Quebec want to separate? I haven't really seen anything on YouTube where people are making active efforts to understand the other point of view. And that's the main reason I'm doing this. I want other English-speaking Canadians like me to really get to hear Quebec's history told through someone who believes Quebec should separate and be an independent state. And I think that will help people to understand Quebec's point of view as told by the Québécois. And I think, on the other hand, hopefully some Québécois viewers can hear me pushing back at moments on why I think Quebec should stay, and maybe broaden their understanding of, okay, these Canadians aren't so bad, or, okay, maybe there are some things I haven't fully considered either. And with no further ado, let's get right to this conversation on the independence of Quebec. Jérémy, thanks for being here with me today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Yeah, welcome to the new travel. Today we're talking about Quebec separatism. And what better way to celebrate the future of this country or countries than to have a couple beers?
Yeah,
prepared in Quebec.
Independence.
Quebec independence.
Yeah, that's kind of like, it's already a certain thing that I've noticed. People from outside of Quebec tend to talk about separatism. We tend to talk about independence or sovereignty.
Okay. You think that difference isn't coincidental? What's the?
Well, I think that it's
more negative to call it separatism. Like you're separating from us.
Yeah, in a certain way. It's like you're depicting it as like breaking up, essentially. But for us, it's more about standing on our own 2 feet rather than breaking apart. There's kind of this perception of the future under an independent Quebec where we're very conscious of the reality that because we already have historical ties with Canada, because of our geographical position, because of our economic realities, we're always going to have ties with Canada. And so even as an independent country, we won't necessarily say, no more Canada, we're closing ourselves off from you. That's kind of why at the beginning of the modern Quebec independence movement, under René Lévesque with the first referendum, it was more about sovereignty association. And then it grew into full-on independence later in the 90s.
Oh, we got a lot to unpack here. Okay, before we go too far, I just wanted to quickly introduce, who are you?
My name is Jérémy Côté. I am the co-spokesperson for the Comité d'Action Politique pour l'Indépendance du Québec with Québec Solidaire. Recently turned 29 years old yesterday. Yeah, that's pretty much me.
Have you lived all your life here in Montreal or this general area?
In Montreal Island, no, but I grew up in the greater Montreal. So I grew up in Brossard, pretty much, which is right across the Champlain Bridge.
I'm relatively new to the province of Quebec. Grew up in Manitoba. I was actually born in Ottawa when I was 6 years old. Moved to Manitoba. Grew up in Winnipeg, in the middle of nowhere, as I used to say. And then I moved away to British Columbia for school. So I lived in Kelowna. Some people might know that place, some people might not. Small city in the interior of British Columbia. Then I moved to Vancouver. Then I moved international. I left Canada behind. And then eventually, after all that journey, I discovered perhaps my favorite city in the world, Montreal, where we're sitting today having these beers. Jérémy, you believe in Quebec independence?
Yeah, and I believe more broadly in just the principle of sovereignty. All people have a moral right to democratic self-determination and to be recognized for that determination. And that's kind of my true north in terms of principles that guide me through all of my political actions.
Interesting.
So when it comes to Quebec independence, when it comes to defending Indigenous sovereignty, especially their ancestral sovereignties that kind of go unrecognized a lot of the time, even when it comes to, women's issues, recently there's been a lot of talks about, women's reproductive health with the revoking of Roe v. Wade, and now there's been a big push in Quebec as a response to that to secure women's reproductive rights, and I see that kind of being a movement driven by women's will to remain sovereign over their own bodies.
Right.
So to that I see, again, this principle of sovereignty, people wanting to have control over their lives and wanting to essentially determine their own future.
Okay. In the context of this conversation, I'm going to be representing stay in Canada perspective. But anyone who knows my work hopefully will know that I do my best to understand the province of Quebec through conversations like this. I'm not someone who is trying to make some caricature of Quebec as something that it's not. I'm not I'm not JJ McCullough on the other side of the country talking about a place I've rarely been to. I've lived here, I've had conversations. I live in a very francophone part of Montreal, and I appreciate and love this province and the city for what it is. And so I'm not at all trying to force Canadian identity on Quebec. I think one thing that would be helpful, especially for any international viewers, is how did we get into this mess in the first place? Can you give a brief outline of the history of Quebec?
The history of Quebec, that's going far.
Brief.
But if you want to give a history, maybe
before my battery dies.
Before we started filming, you talked about maybe discussing the history of how Canada became a country.
That's a good idea.
So I can give a bit of the context of what motivated Confederation. There were recognitions of economic vulnerabilities from all of the different British colonies, north of the United States, that they thought Confederation could help resolve that by forming a stronger unit. There was, the Maritimes needed connection to the railroad, which was one of the conditions for them joining with Confederation. Then there was also the British Empire wanted to kind of get rid of the expenses that came with the defense of its colonies. So by giving them the jurisdiction to defend themselves, then they would be able to kind of offload that cost.
Yeah. By
letting the colonies stand more by themselves. There was the legislative deadlock in between Quebec and Ontario, if I'm using modern terms, which back then were forced into a single colony by the Union Act of 1840. So that was kind of seen as a resolution to that deadlock, because both of them, through Confederation, would become their own distinct provinces.
Yeah.
And there was a big fear of American expansionism, northern.
Good thing we don't need to deal about that anymore. what silly times they lived in where American expansionism was a problem.
Especially because at the time there was during the talks for the, I believe, for the Alaska Purchase.
Okay. Yeah. So this was a real thing. The U.S. had significantly more people.
Yeah.
I think it's fair to say more capital.
Absolutely.
It was a rising power even back then, and Canada had less people.
Right around the time of Confederation, the United States were not exactly a growing power because they were in the midst of a civil war.
Okay, so the U.S. Civil War, obviously. But more broadly speaking, is it fair to say that the founding of the concept of Canada as we know it, at least this is how, growing up, again, I grew up in Winnipeg, I was taught my history with English language books in Anglo-Canada. How I began to understand Canada was there were the British and there were the French and there were the Americans, and there was a war and the British won, and so I'm not saying that it was all roses and dandelions to begin with. I know that there were problems, but in general, we worked together, and that togetherness might have stopped the United States from taking over Canada at a time when this country was very fragile and America was in full manifest destiny. This is Spanish colonies to the south. Yeah, we'll just take that. The unexplored west. Yeah, we're going to take that too. The north, well, maybe we'll take that. Oh, wait, the French and English are kind of teaming up together and could actually stop our resistance. And I also understand the capital being Ottawa as being kind of a compromise between the two.
Well, actually,
we're going to put, I'll just quickly finish this. I want to hear your thoughts, but we're going to put the capital on the border of Ontario and Quebec, a city that in theory has two languages. Now, I know, I was just there. I know there's more English in Ottawa than French, but it's more of a compromise than Montreal leaning more French and Toronto leaning more English would have been. So that's how I began to understand the concept of Canada. It's a compromise between these two groups who have a difficult history, but together we make Canada and together we're strong. How would you see it?
I see it more as it was a union that was imposed upon us by the British Empire after the conquest, despite conflict, institutional conflict, being continuous. And so to me, the idea that we came together is a little fallacious, because it's more like we were forced to exist within the same borders. We were forced to exist under the same powers. After the rebellions of
colonized, would you describe it as colonization?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we
and I'm not denying that word. I just want to use that word because I never actually heard that word used until I came to Quebec and began to hear a different understanding of the history. I never would have read in a book when I was a kid, the British colonized the French, and then, it's a shift, which is quite interesting.
Among many circles, it's still among many circles, it's still a little bit of a contentious term, at least outside of Quebec, to say the word colonized, because colonized usually refers to actions taken upon an indigenous group.
Yeah.
But when you look at the way in which colonization functions, uprooting of the institutions of the people who were there before the colonizing power, their denial of control over their own affairs, the denying over their own identity, the denigration of their culture, their languages, their history, their economic exploitation, you see that really it worked in similar ways.
So for someone who's watching who didn't pay close attention in history class, or, as I said, maybe wasn't taught all the info based on where they were taking their history class, do you have any examples of that denigration that you're talking about? In what ways were...
let's say we talk about after the rebellions of 1837 and 1838, there was the Durham Report, where Lord Durham was sent to the colonies to establish, hey, what caused the rebellions in the first place, during which Ontario was fighting for responsible government and Quebec, under the Parti Patriote, essentially had declared independence.
Okay. Roughly what time was this?
1838 and 1837.
1838, yeah. Quebec.
Well, there was a rebellion in which Quebec aspired to become an independent country. There was a declaration of independence, but the rebellions were, at the end, the rebellions were fought back by the British armies, and then in Quebec, a lot of villages were burnt down as reprisal.
Jeez.
And so the Lord Durham, who was sent to evaluate what exactly caused the situation, said that essentially the people of Quebec were a base people without literature or history who needed to be assimilated. And that's why
some colonial shit right there.
And that's why he recommended that the two colonies, I'm using modern terms here just for simplicity's sake, of Ontario and Quebec should be fused, which caused the Union Act. And also the banning of the French language in government and courts. And also the granting all the other British colonies responsible government. So basically parliament that would be able to govern internal affairs to all of its colonies, except of course Quebec being forcibly merged with Ontario. It was a way of denying Quebec that same right. And also there was the seat repartition, which was made to be even, despite the fact that Quebec had a much larger population, which meant that proportionally Ontario was overrepresented. Mix that with the fact that the French language had been banned from governments and courts, it made it so that the vast majority of people from Quebec could not aspire to hold office, What
time period was the French language banned from?
8 years.
8 years, wow.
Yeah, so between 1840 and 1848.
Just based on, well, obviously what you're saying, there was well, I don't know if there was any logical base for it other than like we need to suppress this.
Well, the logical base was actually openly stated in the Durham Report. It called for our assimilation and the eradicating of our language.
Okay. I'm sure there's a lot more important context that you could touch on. You're obviously very well educated on these matters. But if we jump forward a bit to today or more contemporary times, how do you see Canada has two official languages, English and French. Now, as I mentioned, I've lived a few places across this country. I know very well that a full-on Francophone Québécois who lands in Vancouver and wants to...
Yeah.
You're going to struggle. You're going to struggle, to say the least. In fact, you're going to not be understood, and
most likely not going to be able to find a job.
So yeah, bilingualism of Canada is, I won't quite call it a myth, but it's definitely overstated, and I recognize that. However, do you see English Canada making some kind of amends for historical wrongs, or do you feel like even today, like there's no, like how do you feel about today's situation?
Largely, I think that there's not even a recognition of them. There's not even a recognition really of the full harms caused. Like you talk about the ways that you were taught Canadian history.
Okay.
I talked to you about the rebellions of 1837, 1838. I talked to you about the Durham Report. I talked to you about the Union Act. Is that something that's being taught in one of the schools, let's say in Manitoba?
If it is, it's like a paragraph in Canadian history. It's not a class or something. You know what I mean? Like it's if it is, I think. Again, it's been a while since I've been in a class. So if there's any English teachers out there or Canadian history teachers out there, you can correct me. But I think that at least when I was a kid in the late '90s, early 2000s, it was still too. Every country has a vision of how there's a reality, and then there's how you want to see yourself, right? Mm-hmm. And in the same way that I think countries like the United States, they really don't. They're really uncomfortable around slavery or stuff. There's certain topics that really it's like.
I actually think that's another good example.
You can't fully. I mean, people know it's a thing, but it's like, oh, that's an uncomfortable thing. Let's not talk about it too much. Maybe the mistreatment of French Canadians in early history is kind of like. But we like to see Canada as a friendly, polite, cooperative place that questions the narrative that some people have in their minds. So let's not teach that too much.
Well, you bringing up slavery is actually a good point. Like up until rather recently, we didn't talk much about slavery being a reality in Canada as well.
Yeah.
It's like the same things about the KKK. Canada had the KKK. It was heavily mobilized against Catholic groups, against other against other ethnic minorities, especially against Indigenous people, and history that goes against the national narrative of Canada. Essentially because I think that every national narrative mostly describes what a country aspires to be rather than what it is. Or that
what does Canada aspire to be, and what is Canada?
I think that in some ways, yeah, Canada does aspire to be this kind, welcoming place.
Yeah.
But then by not taking really into full consideration its history, the biases that have come within its founding, the cultures within it, the institutional, and how those help shape the institutions that uphold the country, you know, we end up not really recognizing them and resolving them. And that's kind of what brings me back to also the early days of Confederation, where a big motivation behind Confederation was English-Canadian nationalism, a movement in favor of one unified country in which the English language would be dominant and in which loyalist culture would be dominant. And, you know, as we can see, across most of Canada, that nationalism was successful in creating what it wanted. Especially when it comes to loyalist culture. I mean, up until the end of World War I, the British Empire still controlled Canada's foreign affairs. And
yeah. I mean, that's an interesting point, you know. I don't mean to shift responsibility off of Canada as I know it, but we're talking about very small population sizes for a couple of centuries there. I mean, some people, like I've heard it said that Canada, as we know it, was really defined by World War I and II. It was like somehow the war effort defined us as a nation more than before. You were just, okay, you're just this colony, and it's just, all right.
The very identity of Canadian wasn't as much of a thing back then, at least in English Canada.
Yeah.
In Quebec, we used to refer ourselves to ourselves as Canadiens.
Right.
All even before the British conquest. It's kind of funny because when we look at Canada, it's just like, okay, well, we had our identity as Canadian.
Yeah.
Then the label of Quebec as a province was put on us. The identity of Canadian was kind of taken by English Canada after World War I. So this term that we used to refer to ourselves as this kind of like national identifier was taken away from us. It took us a while, and we ended up just creating a new one.
Why do you want Quebec to be an independent nation?
Honestly, it's because when I look at the history of Canada, I see it as one that's rife with institutional conflict between Quebec and Canada, Quebec and the British Empire. It's because Canada was in many ways governed and formed in ways to make us subservient to it. You know, a province is always subservient to the powers that reign over it. And so to always be a province is to essentially always remain in this colonizer role, this in-between. Being a nation, always fighting to be recognized for it.
Yeah.
Wanting to be able to govern our own affairs, never really being able to.
Now,
wanting to stand on our own 2 feet, always being denied the right to. Wanting our own constitution, and instead having one imposed upon us, despite the fact that we've never been able to fully consent to it.
Yeah. Quebec never officially signed the Canadian Constitution.
Despite many attempts.
Yeah.
I mean, I think our latest attempt at really signing the Constitution was in 2017.
I didn't
our
know
premier
that.
at the time, Philippe Couillard,
yeah.
opened the idea of like, maybe we could open up the Constitution and then make some amendments to make it agreeable for Quebec to sign it.
Yeah.
And back then, the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, just said, we're not opening the Constitution. Categoric no.
Yeah. Okay, so for Anglophones outside of Quebec, we understand that there is there are Québécois who desire independence. There are different groups, different political groups sometimes, who have different points of view on what that could look like or why they want that. As you mentioned, you're associated with
Québec Solidaire.
Québec Solidaire. I would like to hear a few words on what Québec Solidaire's vision is for an independent Quebec, And then if it's not too much to ask, maybe like, is there another big group who has a different vision, and how you differ from that?
I mean, historically, obviously, there's the Parti Québécois, which has been the one, party in the National Assembly leading the charge for independence. Quebec Solidaire was founded a lot more recently in 2006.
Okay, so if some Canadians are listening and they recognize Parti Québécois, but they don't know Quebec Solidaire as much, it's because, as you're saying, it's a much newer movement, and it seems like, from the little I know, it's been rising steadily, right?
I mean, in the past few elections, there were some gains. Started off with only one MNA, then 4, then 10, then 12.
Do you see the Parti Québécois as allies in a similar goal, or is that not how you would see it?
I think that we're aligned on certain issues and differ on others.
Yeah.
That's kind of what ended up justifying distinct parties.
Okay, yeah.
Whereas the Parti Québécois always aimed to essentially be a coalition for independence. So both left and right forces within the same party.
Okay.
Which causes it to be sometimes inconsistent on certain issues. Depending on which branch of the coalition has more influence and more power.
Okay, that's interesting. So it's actually shifting. Their ideology is shifting based on the...
Yeah, it can shift. Quebec Solidaire was always more of just, we are a left-wing independentist coalition.
Yeah.
And essentially it is our principles and our left-wing values and objectives that has led us to really recognizing that sovereignty, as much national as popular, was an inevitable end that needed to be reached.
Do you share some viewpoints with NDP, or would you not make that comparison?
There's ties between the two parties, I mean, like, just as much as there's some members of Quebec Solidaire, like in my committee, who were, let's say, candidates for the Bloc Québécois in the last federal elections. There's also others who were candidates for the NDP. Like,
I know this is kind of a loaded word, but would people describe it as a socialist party? Do you see that as being part of it, or not?
Yeah, if you look up if you just look up its Wikipedia page, it's described as democratic socialist.
Democratic socialist.
But, it's, again, like a broad coalition, so we have more center-left people, we have more further left people. I mean,
Well, I think in some ways Quebec is clearly, and I'm not talking about any particular party, I'm talking about just the culture as I understand it, I think is clearly more to the left than, I was going to say anywhere else in Canada. It's hard to say because, like, British Columbia has its own brand of, like, leftism, and, like, is really, like, even Manitoba, like, there's a lot of people who are, like, in Manitoba, like, Indigenous rights and land acknowledgements is a huge thing. It's very, very normal, more so almost than anywhere in North America, I would say. In BC, like, the environment is so important to people. They love the nature, the ocean, the mountains. Like, there's a real, like fiery, like, we need to save the planet brand there. But here, I feel it's more like we look after the community here.
Yeah, in many ways, Quebec has been a bit more left-wing when it comes to building institutions. And I think that a lot of that has been driven by by sovereignists, honestly. I mean, that big wave really started with the Quiet Revolution, with Jean Lesage and René Lévesque, who later created the Parti Québécois, was a minister in Jean Lesage's government. And, he spearheaded the nationalization of hydroelectricity, the creation of Hydro-Quebec. And that kind of that started it off, and the creation of our healthcare ministry, education ministry, all of it, and that also continued with our pharmacare program, our subsidized daycare program. We have a lot more. Like housing co-ops in Quebec is a thing that's a lot bigger than in other parts of Canada. The fact that our biggest banking institution is a credit union federation. The fact that even Québécois immigrants created the first credit union in the United States.
Really, huh?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, actually to help French Canadian in the United States who were being denied banking services by Anglo-Saxon-owned banks.
Is that so, huh? Wow.
Yeah, because they were Catholics.
Jeez.
And so yeah, I do think that like the independence movement has driven us to essentially build institutions.
Yeah.
Almost as like creating a bedrock or creating a foundation upon which we could stand on our own once independence would succeed.
Perhaps a difficult question, but to what extent does nationalism play a role in Quebec's desire for independence? I mean, you could see Quebec, and I would say every province within Canada as it's now known, is very multicultural. But there is also, is it fair to say that there's certain people who see Quebec's, it's like, it's always been the French against the British, and we are different, and so that is like the core of the difference?
Yeah,
or do you not see that being a relevant factor anymore?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there is nationalism is a big part of it. It comes in varying form.
Yeah.
We, with Quebec Solidaire, we tend to be more on the civic nationalism side.
Right.
And I mean, at the end of the day, it's like nationalism is bound to rise when a nation feels under attack, right? Nationalism has been in a huge rise, let's say, in Ukraine because of the war being attacked in Russia. So
yeah, that's
whenever a nation feels attacked,
yeah,
rallying behind the nation increases. And the thing about the everlasting conflict, institutional conflicts that we've had with Canada, is that it kind of keeps that rallying alive.
Yeah. So
you were talking about multiculturalism. It's also like another cultural distinction that Quebec has, where we don't necessarily ascribe to multiculturalism in the same way that Canada does. We ascribe more to a different form of multiculturalism, which is interculturalism. And it pretty much just says that we have, yes, our dominant culture, we have our national culture, but we want to welcome people to come in and partake in it, participate in it, and help shape it as our history goes forward. Kind of a perspective that we have for it is, I'd like to take, for example, the Irish immigrants who came in during the potato famine.
Yeah, mid-19th century.
There was a huge drive to integrate them into Quebecois society. A lot of essentially Catholic solidarity around that, and it made it so that the Irish immigrants, yes, massively did integrate into Quebec society, and also helped influence it with, their music ended up affecting our folkloric music, and now the Irish jig is part of our national patrimony. So that's kind of like a big example that I like to bring up. But there's also like the Haitian community in many ways has helped shape the realities of like Greater Montreal, and has helped contribute to Quebec's culture in this region a lot. Yeah,
largest Haitian community outside of Haiti here in Montreal. Obviously, in addition to that, we have, it's for obvious reasons, Quebec attracts immigrants from Francophone nations around the world, so large North African populations, and certain countries that are connected by the French language will end up making their way to the province of Quebec.
Yeah, that's kind of why we have such a sizable Vietnamese population.
Not to say the least about the French, who we're here in the plateau right now in Montreal.
Yeah.
And,
Privatist.
Yeah. Which, that's a whole nother discussion. But many people from France have also started lives, and I think enjoyed what Quebec has to offer. I think I meet a lot of people who, this is a bit of a tangent, but I sometimes hear people from France say, life here is just so much more chill. It was so stressful back in France, and the politics is messy, and I just wanted to get out. And now I feel like Montreal is so calm, and it's like there's an idea that like you could have a life here that you couldn't over there. don't you feel like everything considered, this is where I need to push back against the idea of separatism, or independence rather, a little bit. Don't you feel as we sit in this beautiful park in Montreal at the end of a beautiful summer that there's a delicate balance that is potentially at risk of falling apart? And what I mean by that is, if I can use the analogy of like a marriage, like you have difficult moments, you have fights, and sometimes one partner actually did something really kind of unforgivable to the other partner, to the extent it, like, let's say someone cheats or like something awful happens, to the extent in which you logically speaking, you can say, you know what, I'm going to walk away, and this was never a fair agreement to begin with. You did this, you did this, you did this, all of these things. And then that leads you to separate, that leads you to be independent. But that doesn't always lead you to be happier. It's a big question mark what an independent Quebec would actually look like. Whether it would be a place where life would be better and better, or whether it would be a place that would have serious difficulties, and that could lead to a feeling of isolation from the rest of Canada, a feeling of like already you could say there's some tension in little ways, but that could get worse and worse, and suddenly maybe I couldn't sit here in a park in Montreal speaking English because it'd be seen as, go back to Canada, and vice versa. Like, it would just flame tensions in a way that
I can already
just to finish the thought quickly, just very quickly, you see countries like India and Pakistan, you see like how the path in that direction, even if it feels like we need this, can lead to some dangerous places. And that's my only thought on, can't this marriage, so to speak, be saved? What do you think of that idea?
I think that, the analogy of a marriage is one that we hear very often. For me, it's more like it was a forced marriage. It was a marriage that was forced upon us by the British Empire to begin with.
Yeah.
And, it's not one that Quebec ever chose. It's not one that Quebec was ever given a right to choose. We think about the context of the initial Confederation. Quebec was not given an independent voice, an independent free voice on the matter, because it was forced in this legislative union with Ontario. So we never chose to be part of Canada in the first place. A marriage requires a license, a demonstration of a mutual agreement. Quebec and Canada don't have a shared constitution where both parties have signed their agreement. And that's largely because Canada denied us that right. The initial modern constitution of 82 was signed in the dead of night while a premier was sleeping. And was always perceived as a great betrayal here in Quebec, because it felt like a betrayal.
Slap in the face.
Well, it felt like a betrayal not just from the federal government, who, in our view, negotiated in bad faith by essentially cutting us out. It also felt like a betrayal at the hands of the other provinces, because there was beforehand a mutual agreement to act as a common front. You again use this analogy of a marriage. It's kind of like Quebec was forced into a marriage that it didn't want in the first place. This marriage was been rife with conflict, many of which still go unacknowledged by one party.
Yeah.
It is one that we have demonstrated a will to leave with the independence movement and the two referendums, and it's only when we really demonstrate a will to leave that then there's this outpouring of love towards Quebec by Canada. And to me, it's kind of like the image of the neglectful husband who all of a sudden goes, no, wait, honey, I can change, just as the neglected wife is about to walk out the door.
Yeah. So you've watched my YouTube channel for a while.
Yeah.
Would you say I treat Quebec respectfully?
Yeah, I would say that you do. The thing is that when I make these descriptions, I'm not describing necessarily the people.
Yeah.
I'm describing the the states, the institutions.
I think that's an important distinction. I think both sides should remember that. But to the other point, do you also share any anxiety about what an independent Quebec would look like? I mean, there's the goal, and then there's the what happens the day after. Do you have any thoughts on what happens the day after?
That actually brings me to like Quebec Solidaire's approach towards independence.
Okay, let's do it.
Where essentially our model of how we would reach that point in the first place would be that upon forming government, we would create an independently elected constitutional assembly. And the whole point of it would be to consult the population and to draft a constitutional project for an independent Quebec that would then be adopted via referendum. And so that way, you don't have this like blind check signed to the Quebec government of going, okay, we want a country, make of it what you want. It would be more of like, okay, this is actually the kind of independent Quebec that is being offered to us. We have a legislative foundation for it. It helps remove this fear of the unknown, which I think is something that the status quo utilizes a lot to reinforce itself. Even when you're in a bad situation, the fear of the unknown always comes with, yeah, but what if this other thing ends up worse?
Yeah.
What if it ends up better?
You know,
in many ways, I think that, there is no guarantees about how an independent Quebec would become, the same ways that there are no guarantees of how Canada as an independent country would also become. And that's kind of a fear that we have as well when we look at the conservative parties with Poilievre.
I mean, it'd be kind of weird on the map, wouldn't it? Like, we'd have Quebec, and then we'd have the little Maritimes over there, and then the big...
Yeah. I mean, it could, but again, that's another thing about our geographical reality is that it would probably be part of the post-referendum negotiations of saying, okay, well, we kind of need to be able to establish some kind of free travel between one another. Or that's
maybe
just
Quebec,
spitballing.
Maybe Quebec would just be such a beautiful place that the Maritimes would just join them and be like, all right, bye, Canada. Actually, we're like this neighbor better than the old one.
In my view, is if they would want to join us and if they would agree to, the foundation that we lay out, let them come.
You hear that, Canada? They're taking our provinces one by one. No, just kidding. No, I love the Maritimes. I got to get them more often, actually. Some of the nicest people. Honestly, some of the nicest people.
But yeah, it's there's this fear of the uncertainty. But to me, also, like, I know that an independent Quebec would never be a constant in a certain way of, like, how it ends up. Would it be more left-wing? Would it be more right-wing? Well, no country is left-wing forever. No country is right-wing forever.
Yeah, it's true.
Governments change. Sure. That's the nature of democracy, and that's the nature of time. So I'm not necessarily as scared of it as I would say that it's just a continuation.
Yeah. And by the way, I want to state one thing because I know a video like this could attract people who are passionate about this cause and might not know my content so well. When I was talking about like Quebec nationalism and stuff, I'm not someone who believes that you sometimes hear that Quebec is very national and is like a racist place to outsiders. I don't believe that to be true. That's not my lived experience here in Montreal. And I have a lot of immigrant friends who I think can second that statement. I think it's there are unique approaches to certain issues that differ from the rest of Canada, but to your point, that comes from having a unique culture and viewpoint, which is not shared from. I mean, every nation will have a different viewpoint.
Yeah, well, it's
not
whether
always
that's
a nation
shared,
within Canada.
But it's not just the fact that it's not always shared. It's also the fact that it's not always considered as legitimate.
Right. Well, we're starting to lose daylight here, so there's a couple of things I wanted to ask before I get the chance. Actually, would you mind holding that for 1 second?
Yeah, of course.
I wanted to, let me just see. Hope I'm not putting you on the spot too much by asking that.
I'll try not to shake too much.
No, you're doing great. There's a question I hope that both of us can answer. And then after that, if you have any questions for me or anything else you want to touch on, I'm all ears. One of the things I want to do here, and I think you first of all, you reached out to me to help make this video possible, and I'm really grateful for that, because for a while I've wanted to have a conversation like that. And I want to show that it is possible for people who have differing views on something as heated as Quebec independence to sit in a park and have a beer and have like a good discussion about it, you know? It doesn't always have to be this political mess that we sometimes see politicians get into. What I'd like to ask you, do you think that there's something Quebec can learn from Canada and something Canada can learn from Quebec? Do you feel like that there's something worthwhile on both sides there?
I think there's a few things that we could learn in terms of like recent developments on how to approach indigenous nations, and it's a certain way that we have moved in this similar direction, but in our own way. I would perhaps like our current government to take inspiration from Wab Canoe in Manitoba, but that's I don't think François Legault is much interested in that.
Shout out to Wab Canoe, yeah. First Indigenous Canadian premier.
Yeah, but
if I'm not mistaken.
But it's also when it comes to we can use different terms when it comes to institutional discrimination or systemic racism. There are some recognitions within the larger Canada that we don't necessarily have here, and I think that comes from our national sensibility of having this narrative around us of being called racist a lot of the time that makes us very sensitive around that, where essentially English Canadians going, oh, I was looked at the wrong way for speaking English. They're so racist. There's kind of like, there is a bit of this narrative where the rest of Canada doesn't necessarily hear about Quebec's good doings, because most media tends to focus on sensational things, and sensational things tend to always veer on the negative, and that depicts a very bad image of us. And so I think that's us being faced with what we end up calling Quebec bashing. Makes us very sensitive to the opinions of Canada that Canada can hold towards us, and make us sometimes hypersensitive. But I think that those are avenues in which we could learn to be better.
What can Canada, the rest of Canada, learn from Quebec?
Well, first of all, French.
That was funny.
But yeah, like you talked about this mentality of like, Montreal is so much more relaxed, it's less busy here, there's more of like this joy of living, joie de vivre.
Yeah.
I think that's something that Canada could definitely learn from us. Also, like, not being afraid of building up institutions that we've built. Some provinces have followed our path by, building some, provincial farmer care plans for those in need. They haven't yet built a universal one. I think that's definitely something that they should do. I think that also the provinces should put in place their own subsidized daycare, should nationalize their electricity distribution if they haven't, if they haven't yet. I don't think that any of them has. These nation-building projects, a lot of the time, the parts that really matter are in the provincial jurisdictions, but many provinces don't take on that responsibility in the rest of Canada. And then you have the federal government, which, the NDP forced the Liberals to create a farmer care plan, to create a dental care plan, which we also have here. And then the federal government has to come with agreements with the provinces and essentially go like, oh, hey, we'll get you to do these things. I think that Canadian provinces should learn that it's best for them to take the initiative.
Interesting. Very interesting. Well, I think what Canada could learn from Quebec would be, I mean, I'll speak more generally about Montreal because that's what I know best, but yeah, the urbanist culture here, the ability that two young people can live without a car and can get around the city and meet their friends. And like, what did I do today? I went to the bank, I went to the grocery store, I had to get my bike repaired, I went to the bike repair shop. All of that I did without a car. All of that, my life, I live without a car. And I think that's a lifestyle that people who grew up in it, it's like a fish in water. It's just like, yeah, of course. Like I'll bike and walk, or I'll take the metro. You know, you go to the suburbs of Winnipeg, it's a different story out there.
Oh, I can tell you. You go into the suburbs, you go into Quebec suburban towns, or like the rest of Quebec. Car culture is very strong.
Okay. So we can't fully blame the Anglos for that one, maybe. But in all seriousness, like there is a lot to love about Quebec, and I think even just the fact that, you know, like we were joking right before I hit the record button on this video about how, you know, you can always see, you know, the big Q, the made in Quebec, and everything from your beer to the produce to, there's just a very strong culture of like creating cool things here, especially around like food and drink. And I just think it's really like, it's a shame that a lot of those products aren't properly shared across Canada. They're like harder to find. I think there's a wealth of cool stuff here that is often just distributed within Quebec, but could be better distributed across the country. And same thing, you know, in BC, there's great craft beers that I'm not necessarily going to find in a Depot or in Montreal. Mm-hmm. It's just, we have so many cool things in this country, but maybe in part because we're so big geographically, we have these bubbles. And I think one of the bubbles I experienced when I lived in Vancouver briefly and Vancouver's a great place. That's a big discussion that I've talked about in another video. Both Vancouver and Montreal are cool for different reasons. I think, you know, I think Vancouver's identity is a bit more shallow. It's a bit more pretty and like easy to look at. But Montreal has soul. I think Montreal has like just the culture here is a bit, you know.
Yeah.
Sorry, Vancouver, but you know exactly what I'm talking about.
I mean, as someone who has visited Vancouver, I think that, and whose partner comes from White Rock.
Yeah.
You know, I visited once or twice, and I can say like, Vancouver is nice and pretty, but there's something about it that's just too clean. It doesn't feel lived in.
Yeah.
You know, you go,
modern, clean.
You come to Montreal, and it's kind of like, it feels lived in. It feels like a place where people live, not just a place where people come to shop and come to work, but where people actually build a life.
Yeah. And those are both beautiful. Like, I think it's so cool how just the independent music scene here, like I'll just see like a bunch of punks doing a show under the bridge, and I'm like, damn, I always think like this is the coolest city. I wish I grew up here. Like, people they're just really living, you know, in a way that not every city seems to have. But at the same time, I would say there's a certain, like, when you go to a newer city in Canada like Vancouver, there's a certain energy, like, how can I put it? People are really people are excited about the future. Maybe it's a West Coast thing. It's hard to put my fingers on, but I think there is a certain thing that Quebec could learn from places like Vancouver, and I don't know if I'd say Toronto. I don't know if I want to say we can learn from Toronto. That might be going a bit too far, but Vancouver, maybe we can, Toronto, you know what I'm talking about.
I mean, Toronto knows how to capture fleeing capital. This might be it. That's just a dig at the 1970s capital flight following Law 101.
Yeah, I want to acknowledge you've given me a lot to think about in this conversation, and the fact that I think a lot of, you know, like a lot of people who would study and think a lot about colonialism and think a lot about, like Canada, you did these awful things. They wouldn't make the logical leap to say, but you also did it to the Quebecois. You know what I mean? It would be seen as these were the white colonial powers and they were the baddies. And the idea of something happening between those powers is like a leap that not everyone takes, but it might be more understood that way in Quebec society. And I think the fact that often we're literally speaking different languages and it's being written about and taught in one way and in another way, that certainly doesn't help the divide. Mm-hmm. It's like there's two different conversations happening.
I mean, you mentioned before, but Manifest Destiny in the United States, taking over Spanish-owned colonies. The Spanish settlers in those colonies, they were colonizers too. Yeah. And then the United States came in, conquered, and colonized themselves. Yeah. We can also talk about Louisianization, where...
Sorry, I just... man, I feel like this conversation's getting so fascinating, but we are quickly losing daylight.
Yeah, unfortunately. But we can talk about Louisianization very quickly, where after the Louisiana Purchase, the Cajun people in Louisiana quickly lost their constitutional protections, had their language institutionally repressed, and that led to really the decline of French over there.
Yeah. And of course, they came from the Acadians,
who were forcibly displaced in the ethnic cleansing.
Speaking of undertaught history.
Yeah, the Great Displacement.
They could probably use a couple more chapters in the Canadian history classes, because I'm ashamed to admit I didn't know Acadian history until I was an adult. And when I learned about it, it really shocked me.
Yeah.
Yeah, so hopefully that can give people a couple of rabbit holes to go down if you want to learn more about this, because...
But for me, it's the whole aspect of Louisianization is interesting, because that's something that François Legault and other politicians of Quebec have brought up as their reason to strengthen the protections around the French language. Like fearing ending up like Louisiana. But if we look at the forces that make Louisianization happen, really, it was institutional discrimination and systemic racism. At the very beginning of it, that's what caused it. This institutional repression of the Cajun people is what led to the decline of the French language.
And I'm sure it leads to a extra strong feeling of, like, when people wonder why there's so many laws and stuff around languages in Quebec. I'm sure that leads to, actually, we're not paranoid. Look at history. Look at what has happened on the same continent.
Just look at the Union. Just look at the Union Act.
Yeah.
Just look at what the other provinces did to their French-speaking communities. We can talk about Regulation 17 in Ontario, and I don't remember the law in Manitoba, the Loi Thornton. There was a law in Manitoba that banned French books in schools. That was repealed in, I think, the mid-1900s.
Wow.
And so, like, when we look at, those other provinces, the way that they've treated their French communities, it does keep that fear in us alive too, because it makes us think, well, if we're in a position of weakness and we lose grasp over our institutions, this could happen to us too.
Jérémy, I think I have to cut you off. Not that this topic is not interesting, but my camera's getting very dark here. But I want to express my gratitude for sitting down and talking about this and helping to teach me and other people around the world, the important story of Quebec. I know there's 100 different directions we could have gone with this conversation, and lots we've left out.
Yeah, and obviously I do give a biased retelling. I'm not going to claim that I'm not.
Yeah. There's things I could talk about that we haven't talked about. I was,
Just
Especially-
wait for part 2.
Yeah, wait for part 2. Leave a comment if you enjoy this. You'd like to see more like this. I think in particular, I was going to bring up the flag of Montreal having 4 and then eventually 5 distinct cultures on it. You know, we have the symbol to represent not just the early English and French, but also the Irish and the Scottish. And then eventually, of course, they added the symbol for the indigenous cultures as well, as I understand it. And that, to me, I think, speaks to something special in this city that can be embraced. And I'm not saying these all need to be equals. I'm not trying to minimize the role of French culture in Quebec's biggest city, not at all. But just, you know, it makes me, it's a very delicate balance that is being walked to have a city like Montreal. And I think it's something to be proud of. I worry that if Quebec became independent, that balance would be thrown off. That's my worry, that things, I can't argue with you on the history. There are many things that you're saying that are deeply correct, and hard for me to hear, actually. As a Canadian who loves this country, it's hard for me to hear. It hurts, you know. But I worry that we could lose something in a province that I love, in a city I love. And so that's what I fight to hold on to. Not to deny any history or to say you're wrong about this or that, not at all. It's more about, there's a lot of cool stuff here that I'm proud of as a Canadian, and as a newcomer in Quebec, I'm proud of this province as well. So yeah, those are my final thoughts. Jeremy, it's been a pleasure, man.
Yeah.
And
Thank you for having me again. It was a pleasure for me as well.
Guess we just leave it at that. Finish your beer. Cheers.
If you're new here, I'm Dan. I'm a one-man team. I plan these videos, I edit these videos, I shoot these videos, I share these videos. So if you appreciate what I'm doing here and you'd like to see more conversations like this in the future, here's a couple ways you can donate. Even a few dollars can make a big difference. So thank you for all of your support.